Ezzard Charles is a boxer who has a very legitimate claim as the greatest of all time in the sport, yet he's a man whose name is never mentioned outside of hardcore boxing circles. And it's worth digging into why the Cincinnati Cobra may be the most underrated great fighter the sport's ever produced. There is of course the fact that he trailed in the huge footsteps of the iconic Joe Louis, or the fact that in his own natural divisions he was never given a title shot. And as a black man, he had to deal with racial politics of the time that severely restricted his career. And many of his greatest victories were over fellow black fighters who were equally as fearsome and as avoided, but more importantly, just as underrated as Charles. However, despite all of this, Charles left an impact on the sport that has been matched by a few, and he has arguably the greatest resume of all time. So let's dig in to the forgotten GOAT of boxing, Ezzard Charles.
Unanimous decision and heavyweight champion of the world, Ezzard Charles.
To understand the depth in Charles' resume, we have to backtrack almost a decade prior to his heavyweight title run, back to 1941, where a 19-year-old Charles had compiled a record of 17 wins to 0 defeats at middleweight. To say that Charles was thrown in with the killers early on in his career would be a massive understatement. In his 18th fight, he would take on the former middleweight champion of the world, Hall of Famer Ken Overlin, who had only just lost the crown in his last fight and had 152 fights banked by then. And Charles' inexperience would show. However, in defeat, he went the distance with Overlin. And it was an experience that ultimately served him well, because just 6 months later, he would successfully defeat former middleweight world champion Teddy Yaros and former light heavyweight world champion Anton Christoforidis. This brutal run of form at such a young age was immediately followed with a rematch against Overlin, where Charles would score a draw. Having already tussled with the best middleweights in the world, he would go on to claim 2 of the most impressive victories of his resume before he'd even turned 22. Charles took on a man that's been labelled as history's most avoided fighter, the great Charlie Burley. The fighting prowess of Burley is so legendary that many experts have held him in the same regard as Sugar Ray Robinson, as the most talented fighter they'd ever seen. The great Archie Moore stated that Burley was the best boxer he'd ever shared a ring with. And while sadly little footage of Burley's career has survived, from what we can see, he was a true defensive genius, and his 50 career knockouts suggests he had excellent power to match. The legendary names of the time in Sugar Ray Robinson and Marcel Cerdan opted to avoid him, so Burley had to take on the fearsome members of the Black Murderers Row, a group of black men that was so skilled that, like Burley, they were avoided with the assistance of the racial politics of the time. Fighters like Lloyd Marshall, Holman Williams, Coco Kid, Jack Chase, Eddie Booker, Aaron Wade and Burt Lytell, with the group of fighters competing in a total of 62 grueling bouts, and it was Burley that emerged as the standout. And outside of these fights, he even knocked out a legitimate heavyweight contender despite only being a natural welterweight. And moving back to Charles, despite being on such a challenging run of form and facing such a fearsome rival, he successively outpointed Burley in back-to-back victories, showing a real statement of intent and a sign of the dominance to come. Having already accumulated a brilliant run at middleweight, by the age of 22, Charles set his sights on the light heavyweight division, where he would really leave a mark on the sport. Later that year, he defeated light heavyweight great Joey Maxim twice in a row before suffering back-to-back defeats to 2 of history's greatest ever light heavyweights, in Jimmy Bivins and Lloyd Marshall. The defeats would ignite a fire within Charles, whose run of dominance over the next 6.5 years are amongst the most impressive ever seen. Across this time period, Charles cleaned up the light heavyweight scene in a fashion so brutal, he's been universally recognised as the greatest light heavyweight the sport's ever produced. Throughout these years, he would go on to avenge the Bivins defeat 3 times, whilst gaining revenge over Marshall twice, both times via knockout. The light heavyweight champion at the time in Joey Maxim would suffer 5 defeats to Charles, whilst fellow light heavyweight champion Gus Lesnovich was KO'd by the Cobra's fists. Then there was Archie Moore, the man who would eventually rule the division for a colossal decade, leaving his own mark as one of the most brilliant fighters the sport's ever produced. The Cincinnati Cobra defeated Moore 3 times out of 3. In his peak, he suffered just 1 split decision defeat to El Murray over a span of 43 fights, a defeat in which he avenged with a knockout. Now by this point in his career, he'd already beaten many of history's greatest middleweights and held 12 wins over the light heavyweight Hall of Famers of the era, amongst the highest numbers compiled in history, yet he'd still never been granted a title shot. so he jumped all the way up to heavyweight. Former heavyweight king Joe Louis had retired from the sport in 1948, having bowed out with an 11th round knockout over Jersey Joe Walcott, ending an 11+ year reign of dominance as the king of boxing. And whilst Louis still had his part to play in Charles' career, it was initially Walcott who finally granted Charles his first shot at a title, the NBA heavyweight crown. And Charles would defeat Walcott via a 15-round unanimous decision. And with Joe Louis struggling financially in retirement, the stage was set for a mega fight. Louis would return to the ring against Charles for the NBA, NYSAC and the Ring Magazine Heavyweight Championship of the world. And when the pair met in the mega fight, Charles defeated Louis, handing the Brown Bomber the first loss he'd suffered in 14 years to cement himself as the most dominant heavyweight in the world. This standout victory against such a legendary name was followed up by a successive victory over Walcott, a KO victory over Nick Baroni, and a further win against Joey Maxim. And it's at this point that Charles had reached the pinnacle of his career, conquering boxing in a way that very few have matched. Over 11 years, he had defeated the greatest middleweights of his time, ruled the light heavyweight scene in a manner none have matched, and moved up to beat all of the great heavyweights of his era. His record was 71 wins to just 5 defeats. He had achieved what Roy Jones Jr. became so renowned for universally in dominating from middleweight to heavyweight, but he'd never been able to receive the shots at the lower weight divisions due to the brutal politics of his time. His resume was already amongst the greatest ever compiled, with 21 victories over Hall of Famers and world champions. And it was around this time where his reign as heavyweight champion was finally ended by Jersey Joe Walcott, who unleashed an uppercut from the gods in their third bout. He would also lose the fourth fight against Walcott, ending their iconic rivalry 2 apiece. But despite losing world honours, he still had life in his fighting resolve, scoring further impressive victories against the likes of Rex Lane, Jimmy Bivins and power puncher Bob Satterfield with a brutal left hook. But having already been in so many wars and tragically killing an opponent in Sam Barudi, Charles was beginning to slow down and didn't fight with that same vicious intent that he had in his younger years. However, there was still one last hurrah in one of the most impressive displays of his resilience. Having become history's oldest heavyweight champion at the time, Jersey Joe Walcott would offer unbeaten challenger Rocky Marciano a shot at his title. Having compiled a lead after 13 rounds, Rocky landed one of the most iconic right-hand knockouts in history. And Marciano would offer Charles his final shot at the title, where over a spirited 15-round effort, Charles would be the only man to ever go the full 15 with Rocky. His efforts had been so compelling that he earned a rematch with Marciano, a fight which so nearly changed the course of boxing history. Charles was 1 round away from stopping Marciano in the second fight when he had opened a horrendous cut which had split the champion's nose in half. Marciano was given 1 round to secure a knockout before he would be pulled out due to the injury, losing both his title and undefeated record. But a testament to his rugged determination and brilliance was that he dug out an 8th round KO victory and immortalised himself as heavyweight boxing's only ever champion to retire with a 100% win ratio. Like most of his era, Charles continued on far too long due to financial issues and suffered many of the defeats on his record whilst well past his best. He suffered with ALS, which eventually left him completely disabled, before he ultimately passed away at 53 years of age in 1975. But whilst Charles may have more losses than the other all-time greats, he's so much more than just a fighter who went toe-to-toe with the greatest heavyweights of his time. He boxed with such a technical excellence and the greatest counterpunching the sport's ever seen, compiling one of the most stacked resumes ever and dominating half the divisions in the sport in a manner that no one's been able to replicate since. He scored a staggering 19 victories in 28 fights against Hall of Famers alone, which are amongst the highest numbers ever produced. His victories against Hall of Famers are as follows. He beat Jimmy Bivins 3 times, Charlie Burley twice, Joe Louis, Lloyd Marshall twice, Joey Maxim 5 times, Jersey Joe Walcott twice, Teddy Yaros and Archie Moore, whilst defeating many other champions and contenders at the time that are yet to be inducted into the International Boxing Hall of Fame.
In 1949, Ezzard Charles was a fighter. He fought for the world's heavyweight championship and won. In 1968, he contracted ALS, a neuromuscular disease related to dystrophy. It left him helpless as a baby. That's why Ezzard Charles is still fighting, but this time, it's for his life. Help Ezzard Charles and thousands like him in their fight against neuromuscular diseases. Give what you can, but give.